Right, well, thanks for inviting me to speak to you this evening. This is my original talk. I do 13 now, and this is called, well, it was called The Lost Mansion Houses of the Black Country, but I'm not too parochial these days, so I include a little bit of Worcestershire and more Staffordshire as well. And I'm going to start off with Joseph Brown's map of Staffordshire dated 1682. And we can see in caricature the places of importance, like the
Okay.
churches. There's St. Peter's at Wolverhampton. The windmills seem quite important. I've come from Wednesbury this evening, quite a few around Wednesbury there. But also what appear to be little dolls' houses, the mansion houses. And these were the places where the lord of the manor dispensed to their tenants from. But to my mind, there were two types of mansion house. There were firstly the homes of the landed gentry, like Drayton Manor that we see here, which was the ancestral home of Sir Robert Peel, built in 1797 and sadly demolished about 1926. Now, the landed gentry meant that people would own estates and they would rent out surplus houses and all the land. And if you wasn't born with a silver spoon in your mouth, then maybe you were one of the pioneers of the Industrial Revolution and had amassed your own fortune to build your own mansion house, like the industrial Solly family did with Toll End Hall, built at Tipton about 1750. I don't know what they call the MEB these days, but it was the site of the MEB offices and sports ground and still is used for that purpose. For our first in-depth look at a mansion house, I'm going to take you to this location, which I'll describe as Junction 1 of the M5 motorway just outside West Bromwich. On the motorway island stands what is fondly known as the Sandwell Arch. Now, many people mistakenly believe it was placed there as an eye catcher for when the motorway was opened in 1970. It's actually been there since 1705, for it was once the grand entrance to the Sandwell Park estate. The story of Sandwell, though, goes back to the year 1180, when William O'Feeney, the Lord of the Manor of West Bromwich, had granted to a Benedictine order of monks the lands on which they built Sandwell Priory, which was suppressed in 1525. The remaining buildings became a private house, first called Priory House, and then later renamed Sandwell Hall. In 1703, William Legge, the first Baron Dartmouth, was searching for a country estate. It's laughable today, isn't it, to imagine him looking around West Bromwich for his country estate. But all those centuries ago, there were acres upon acres of fertile farmland. He hammed upon the remains of the priory and had them swept away, or so it was thought, and in their place had erected the handsome Palladian Sandwell Hall, which was completed in 1705. On the walls inside hung the family portraits. This is Lady Charlotte Legge, a noted society beauty, who was born at Sandwell in 1774. About 1854, William, the third Earl, decided that the Black Country Industrial Revolution was encroaching a bit too close for comfort to his Sandwell Park estate. He upped sticks and moved his family to Patsall, outside of Wolverhampton. Patsall recently sold for £7 million. But Sandwell continued in the ownership of the Dartmouth family, but was leased to several farms and institutions. The house itself ended its days as the lunatic asylum for Birmingham City. before being demolished in 1928. During the demolition, it was a surprise to find that portions of the priory of 1180 had stood intact, encased in the walls of Samuel Hall for all those years. And this is a portion of the chapter house seen in 1948. By 1980, nothing was seen above ground, but between the years of 82 and 88, there was a large-scale archaeological dig, which has revealed on permanent view the ruins of Samuel Priory. Nothing of the hall, though, that's completely gone. I'm going to stay with the motorway theme and take you now to junction 9 of the M6 motorway, where the towns of Wednesbury and Walsall meet at Bescot. Bescot was a Domesday manor established by the Hillary family, and this is possibly the third house to have been erected on the site, in this case in 1780, and by the Slaney family. Now, often these family names live on as street names in your vicinity, and there is a Hillary Street and a Slaney Road in Bescot. Now, thanks to an auction catalogue, we can have a peep inside. Here's the drawing room with, on the right, the floor-to-ceiling carved oak inglenook. Now, important pieces like this were often rescued from an earlier building, and that's the case here, and they would be incorporated into a newer build or trundled off elsewhere. And we've got evidence of this practice a bit later. Here's the conservatory, which was added by the Aston family in the 19th century. To the left, you can see the original external doors and windows. If we look across the gardens towards that conservatory, in the foreground is a ha-ha, a sunken wall, often accompanied with a ditch, which allowed uninterrupted views from your home across your parkland, but prevented stray animals and cattle from getting too close to your private quarters. You can see from this postcard that Bescot ended up as a private college and was sadly demolished in 1928. It's now the site of Pleck Park at Walsall in the shadow of the M6 flyover. Bradley Hall was built in the High Street at King's Wynford in 1596. The date clearly seen above the parlour window to the left. It was the home of the Humphrey family, who were Catholic sympathisers and was said to be riddled with priest hiding holes. By 1920, it was the home of Mr. Henry Webb, who was a local farmer and butcher, and he reduced the status of the building from a manor house to a humble farmhouse. After his death in 1924, his family put it up for auction. It was purchased by another family named Withnell, who gave instructions to the Bromsgrove Guild of Arts to carefully dismantle the property. The Bromsgrove Guild had been responsible for the gates and the railings around Buckingham Palace, and they were very respected in architectural circles. They had the timbers trundled away on the backs of lorries to Stratford upon Avon, where in Tiddington Road they were resurrected as Bradley Lodge. But you can see clearly, can't you, the centrepiece from Bradley Hall at King's Wynford. Now, there were enough timbers left over to build another 3 houses across the road. The story of those belonged to another talk I do called Timber Framed Buildings. Another half-timbered mansion also auctioned in 1924 was Wollaston Hall near to Stourbridge, which had been built in 1617. In the auction room sat the son of Mr. Henry Ford of the motor car fame. Now, his dad had already purchased the steam engine from the Black Country for his museum in the USA. Ford Jr. made off with the timbers and a lot of the oak panelling from Wollaston Hall to be incorporated into his new family home, then being built in America. By 1928, not a timber nor a stone remained on the site of Wollaston Hall. This was Highfields, which stood on the outskirts of Halesowen town centre and was built for a Mrs. Elizabeth Pearsall in 1767 in the Strawberry Hill Gothic style. Now, I'll have to explain to you Strawberry Hill. In 1749, Horace Walpole, son of the Prime Minister Robert, had purchased land at Twickenham and began to build a lavish mansion with ogee-headed doors and windows like we see here at Highfields, crenellations on the roof and finials, and this fancy style became known as Strawberry Hill Gothic, for that's what he called his new home, Strawberry Hill. In 1944, Halesowen Council turned the property into flats, but in 1970, they sent the bulldozers in. Perry Hall, when built in 1569, stood on Staffordshire soil until later boundary changes were to place it in Warwickshire. The moat surrounding it was topped up with water from the nearby River Tame. It was the home of the Goth family, whose title was Lord Colthorpe. This is John, the fourth Lord. By 1931, it had been purchased by Birmingham City. But they had already got Aston Hall. They didn't want the house, they only wanted the land to provide recreation ground for the growing housing estates in the Perry Bar area. So it was razed to the ground. If you go to Perry Park playing fields today, you might be surprised, like I was, to see that the moat is still intact. But who would have believed that Jacobean pile had once occupied the platform? Now, these are a couple of houses which I call famous names in the Birmingham district. I don't have an awful lot of information about them, and they're single slides. I'm going to start with this one. Does anyone recall the original name of Birmingham International Airport? Elmdon. This is Elmdon Hall, seen in 1927. It was demolished about 1955. The next one had a chocolate bar named after it. Bourneville Hall, the original home of George Cadbury. This was demolished in 1906. Now, if I'm to be biased and have a favourite mansion house, I would have to say this, because it stood just a stone's throw from where I've lived all my life in Wednesbury. Now, I was only a babby when it was demolished, or else I'd have laid down in front of the bulldozers, believe me. The sketch is from the Reverend Stebbing Shaw's History and Antiquities of Staffordshire, Volume 2, published in 1801. He describes it as a curious old house at Wednesbury in the road to Walsall. It stood in Walsall Street opposite the library and the cenotaph, and its name was Oakswell Hall. What perhaps made it curious to the Reverend Shaw was the lantern tower on the roof jostling amongst the chimneys. Now, because of the window tax that once was, evidently the windows were bricked up for a time. But the idea was that you'd hang a candelabra up there and the light would give guidance to visitors after dark. It was first mentioned in a document of 1421, but believed to be much older. This is an auction notice from Birmingham's Harris's Gazette, dated March 1825. You can see a third of the way down, Lot 1, Oakswell Hall, is for sale. But what interests me is the third paragraph from the bottom, informing us of the thick or 10-yard coal lying beneath. Now, this was a very important consideration when purchasing land at the height of the Industrial Revolution, because the extraction of the minerals could be the key to your fortune, like coal and limestone. But as we know, mining beneath the properties could make them pit-pulled, but not in Oakswell's case. In 1900, the handsome Wednesbury surgeon, Dr. Walter Garman, carried his new bride across the threshold at Oakswell Hall, which he himself was renting. And this is how the hall looked by the time the Garmans moved in. Can you see the windows reinstated now in the lantern tower? Now, the Garmans had 9 children, and 7 of these were girls. Whilst most of the Wednesbury urchins lived in surrounding slums, the Garman girls, by comparison, lived in luxury at Oakswell Hall, but that didn't stop them turning out right ones. This was Lorna, the youngest, who I'm sure you'll agree had film star looks. She married a wealthy publisher named Ernest Wishart and went to live in his mansion in Sussex. One day she was walking on the sands at Gunwallow Cove in Cornwall and encountered a man who was playing a fiddle and struck up a conversation. He turned out to be Laurie Lee of Cider with Rosie fame. Well, as was natural for the Bohemian Garman girls, she started an affair with him, even bearing one of his children. When Ernest found out and forbade them to meet, they carried on in secret in a little holiday van down the road. But perhaps the best remembered of the Garman girls was Kathleen, who at the age of 20 had arrived in London City with her sister Mary in 1920. Shortly afterwards, she was approached in a cafe by a striking young gentleman who introduced himself as the sculptor Jacob Epstein. He asked her to pose for him and she agreed. There then followed a love affair lasting more than 30 years, during which time she bore him 3 children. So it'll come as no surprise that Epstein's Mrs. Peggy absolutely detested the girl. Peggy must have been very silly or very tolerant, for yet with even more mistresses, they all lived together above Epstein's studio in Hyde Park Corner. His pet dog was named Frisky. I once asked the WI, come on ladies, what did she see in him? And one called out, well, he was good with his hands. Peggy considered Kathleen to be the biggest threat to her marriage. One Sunday morning in 1922, she infamously invited the young lady to a showdown in the drawing room. Kathleen entered what she thought was an empty room. The door slammed shut and the key was turned, and there stood Peggy pointing a little silver revolver at Kathleen's head. Well, lucky for her, she was a dodgy shot, but she did get grazed on the shoulder. Can you imagine the embarrassment for her poor, respectable father back home in Wednesbury when the Times newspaper reported his daughter had crawled into the street on all 4s? After Peggy's death, Epstein made Kathleen an honest woman. He married her. So she became the second Lady Epstein. That ain't bad going, is it, from a talk to a title? After his death in 1959, together with her wealthy American friend, Sally Ryan, she travelled the globe, purchasing works of art to add to the Epstein collection. She so dearly wanted to give this collection to the Black country where she felt they would benefit from its culture. She travelled to Wednesbury intent on purchasing her childhood home of Oakswell and to there open an Epstein Museum, but was saddened to find by now it had been compulsory purchased by the town council and lay in ruins, awaiting its fate. Now, whilst we've got a fine Victorian art gallery in the town, where incidentally my brother's the key holder, the councillors would have nothing to do with this arty-farty collection and refused it. She touted it around until in 1972 it was accepted by near neighbour Walsall, which explains why you've got the Garman Ryan Gallery there today. Kathleen Garman and Sally Ryan. But what of the continuing misfortunes of Oakswell? Well, I salute this Tipton resident, Mr. Bill Wilson, who petitioned Wednesbury Council in vain to be allowed to restore the rooms one by one. We read in 1960 of Bill's intended stately home. Housing Committee Chairman Alderman Vic Steed says, in our opinion, it is no better than a slum. And it's so sad that post-war attitude of out with the old and in with the new has cost us so many historic buildings here in the Midlands, not just mansion houses, humble cottages, and even today industrial buildings. For shortly after this, the only colour picture I've seen was taken of Oakswell. Demolition commenced in the winter of 1962. Opposite Oakswell Hall and between the cenotaph and the library is Hollies Drive, which was once the coach road to the Hollies, a domestic scale house at the crest of the hill. This was the home of Wednesbury's answer to Mr. Darcy, James Russell, who was the proprietor of the Crown Tube Works on the High Bullen. That's where Wednesbury's Leisure Centre now stands. Now, every time James and his brother John were awarded a patent for their improved methods of tube manufacture, he celebrated in a most unusual fashion by constructing a folly in the grounds of the Hollies. So there ended up several of these little castles or keeps. Now, me in 1974 as a 12-year-old and my gang used to play in there. We really were the kings of the castle. But little did I realise its historical significance. It was demolished later in 1974, but the house itself had been swept away 2 years previously, after lastly being used as the head offices for Wilkins and Mitchell, a Darlaston firm which made power presses, and at another plant, a well-known domestic appliance. Does anyone know what that was? Well done, service washers. And the factory's gone now at Darlaston, and there's a housing estate on the site.